B. Collins.
That's me. Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, March 25th, 2020. I don't wish to offend any of my listeners who are people of faith. I happen to be agnostic. And when I see men of the cloth, and it's usually the men, embracing right-wing idiocy in the interests of politics, I call it out. And I call him the GodSquad. We start with Jerry Falwell, Jr. His daddy, over there in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is a hard right Christian gulch, he founded Liberty University. And if you recall, back after 9/11, Jerry Falwell Sr. and Pat Robertson got together and declared that the attack on America, as they saw it, was caused by an angry God who was taking vengeance on gays and on other people who don't live up to whatever the public posturing is of these, again, men of the cloth. So now Jerry Jr., Dad's gone, is running Liberty University. He's had his own little scandals of womanizing. But apparently he had a conversation with his God and decided that this coronavirus is no threat to the devout students and the staff. And I don't really know what the religiosity is of every professor at Liberty University. But he has ordered them back to campus, even as in Virginia the governor has shuttered all of the state universities. And Falwell seems to be trying to support his president, trying to just wish that the coronavirus will go away. And get this, Jerry Jr. said, I think in a way, we are protecting the students by having them on campus together. Because, young people don't have conditions that put them at risk. Now, that's a fallacy. It's a Falwell fallacy that is shared by too many Americans and perhaps people in other parts of the world. So he called his decision to reopen a responsibility to students to enjoy the room and board that they've already paid for. That means he's too cheap to refund it to them in order to protect their health. Now, despite Falwell's insistence, data shows that 20% of hospitalized patients and 12% of intensive care patients are millennials. And one faculty member, and this is why I don't want to presume that they are all Bible thumpers like Falwell, Mary Beth Davis Baggett, an English professor, said Falwell was putting the entire Lynchburg community, their health and lives, at risk. Quote, Liberty is not a bubble where the virus could be contained. Now, she's an independent thinker. And if they offer tenure at Liberty University, well, she'll never get it or they'll take it away from her if she already has it. That's my speculation, but I'd be willing to put a $2 bet on it. Meanwhile, over at the White House, they have a weekly Bible study group. Mike Pence is a regular attendee, Mike Pompeo, who wants to destroy Iran in some sort of military act of God. Well, the Bible study leader is a guy named Drollinger, Ralph Drollinger. So he's a minister. He leads a weekly Bible study group. And after Trump popped this idea that Easter is the perfect day, right? It's the day of Jesus' resurrection. That's the day when we're all going to roll back the stone and declare that the virus is no longer a problem. Well, Drollinger has announced, relative to the coronavirus pandemic crisis, this is not God's abandonment wrath, nor his cataclysmic wrath. Rather, it is sowing and reaping wrath. Now, I don't know what the hell that means, but I wanted to honor him with his own comment. He continued, a biblically astute evaluation of the situation strongly suggests that America and other countries of the world are reaping what China has sown due to their leaders' recklessness and a lack of candor and transparency. Those are Trump talking points. I don't believe they are biblical or derived from a higher power. Now, neither does he miss a chance to condemn, this is the Falwell Sr. part, that those who worship the religion of environmentalism and express a proclivity, you know that's evil already, a proclivity toward lesbianism and homosexuality. These individuals, according to Drollinger, have infiltrated high positions in our government, our educational system, our media, and our entertainment industry, and are largely responsible for God's consequential wrath on our nation. Now listen, Reverend Asshole. This is a worldwide pandemic. The wrathful God you imagine has not visited this on America exclusively. But these myopic Bible thumpers, they'll say anything. Let's see who else attends his Bible study meetings. Good old Ben Carson, Dr. Ben Carson. Betsy DeVos, the billionaire heiress to the Amway fortune. Oh, and Health Secretary Alex Azar. Oh, my God. He's kind of disappeared, if you notice, from the human wallpaper at Trump's endless press room briefings. At least 52 Republican lawmakers also participate in a Capitol Hill version of Drollinger's Bible study. They meet Tuesdays and Thursdays. And the inarticulate Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader from California, and Senator John Thune of South Dakota are frequent participants. And Trump's decision, or his impulse, if you will, to declare that everything's going to be all safe, all clear by Easter Sunday, April 12th, 2.5 weeks from now, was not based on any input from any experts, including Tony Fauci, who is increasing his resistance to Trump's impulsiveness. And Trump says that he picked Easter just kind of because I think the guy on Fox News told him to, but he says that he didn't arrive at it by examining any data. I just thought it was a beautiful time, he said, and pandering to Christians, he said that it's one of his favorite days of the year. It could be because he likes to eat chocolate bunnies head first. I'm sorry if I'm amusing myself too much here today, but this is just so ridiculous. And, you know, you can rant against Trump. I do that every day. But to me, this is funny. It's cruel because while the resurrection of Jesus Christ celebrates life, renewal, redemption, and the prospect of a beautiful afterlife in heaven, this guy is making a calculation that will say, yeah, Americans are going to die. The numbers, they're going to be about the annual flu. That's subject to study later. But he also makes up other horribles. He said, you're going to lose a number of people to the flu. Now, this is not just a flu, but you're going to lose more people by putting a country into a massive recession or depression. You're going to have suicides by the thousands. Really, Don? You first. You're going to have all sorts of things happen. You're going to have instability. Well, he models that every damn day. You're going to have, I just said that. You can't just come in and say, let's close up the United States of America, the biggest, the most successful country in the world by far. And because we're big and successful, ... Well, you know, Trump never is required to complete those fragments of thought. And Fauci, I think, is, trying to navigate dealing with Trump. It can't be easy. But I'm uncomfortable with what he said. He said any new guidelines would not pertain to hotspots like New York, and there could be flexibility in different areas based on data. Quote, we need to know what's going on in those areas of the country where there isn't an obvious outbreak. Really? Now, I recognize that there's some areas that have limited cases so far, and some states may not have huge spikes. But it is prudent, I believe, for all Americans to accept the advice and the policies that have been put in place to try to flatten the curve, reduce the spikes. And one of the real hot spots now is New Orleans. And I don't have any scientific proof of this, but I think I have a pretty strong hunch here that Mardi Gras infected a lot of people in the middle of February. Many people go to New Orleans for Mardi Gras, and then where do they go? They go back home. That plus the spring break crowds in Florida suggests to me that you cannot predict where the next spikes are going to occur. And we know that Trump is not interested in celebrating Easter. He's celebrating capitalism. And he wants to try to limit the damage to the economy on his watch, because he knows that the body count could become a problem for him, but that fundamentally Trump is evaluated on the stock market, and we know that we're going to have a huge drop in gross domestic product here in the second quarter, by some accounts north of 20%. And Trump just can't stand that. Now, moving on from my obnoxious comments about religiosity, one of the things that really limits Trump is he can wish all he wants. But keep in mind, even when he did his about face 2 weeks ago, started to get serious about the virus, stopped denying it, stopped minimizing it, at least a little, he didn't do anything that imposed any kind of national conditions. This happened organically at the state level. And it is the state governors who will actually determine when their stay-at-home orders, when their shuttering of restaurants and bars and other places where people congregate, when those orders will be lifted. And so he could talk for 6 hours a day in his little White House hissy fits, where he mixes misinformation about the virus, about the availability of drugs to treat it, with his attacks on the media and his perceived enemies. Well, even Greg Abbott, the far-right governor of Texas, he says, well, if the goal is to get the economy going, the best thing we can do to get the economy going is to get COVID-19 behind us. He has lapsed into coherence, friends. And a law professor just up the road from me at UC Davis, Elizabeth Joe, in Politico last week, said there is no go-back-to-work law. A community has the right to protect itself against an epidemic which threatens the safety of its members. Right down the road from the White House in Maryland, Governor Larry Hogan, chairs the National Governors Association, said Monday, we're just trying to take the best advice we can from the scientists and all the experts in making the decisions that we believe are necessary for our states. We don't think that we're going to be in any way ready to be out of this in 5 or 6 days or so. Now, Easter's a little past that, but he's got the right idea. And so if we have some kind of partial return to work where we claim that those millennials who are invincible can't get the virus, it's not true. It's an urban myth embraced by Trump. But if we do try to have some half measure. I believe it will lead to a new uptick in infections, in hospitalizations. And the biggest issue we have is as we see these field hospitals, hospital ships, all being deployed with the expectation of a massive overload on our medical care system. It is just, it is unbelievable that Trump thinks he can wish this away. And I've mentioned that a member of my extended family, Brian, is in an ICU on a ventilator in the Beaumont Hospital system in Detroit. Rachel Maddow reported accurately last night that Beaumont, which is the leading healthcare profiteer in the southern Michigan area, they're maxed out. All of the ventilators have been assigned, and I feel good that Brian has one. But the next Brian, who shows up with similar symptoms, what are they going to do for him? Governor Cuomo in New York, who has shown himself to be quite a leader in this situation, he continues to scream, "They sent me 400 ventilators, and I need 30,000. So the dichotomy between those who take this seriously and want to stamp it out and those who want to wish it away is stunning to me. And new polling is just shocking. A Gallup poll Tuesday shows Trump's approval rating tied for the highest point in his presidency at 49%. Pollsters say this could be just a temporary rallying effect. But even some Democrats, about a fifth, have shifted into saying that they approve of Trump's response to the coronavirus. Now, the polling may have been conducted, and in fact it was last week, after Trump had feigned seriousness about this crisis. A new Economist YouGov poll showed 50% rate Trump's performance on jobs as the economy as being positive, only 39% negative. But hey, the stock market, while it has rallied over the $2 trillion that the government's going to borrow to pump into bailing out corporations who are vulnerable because of their own self-inflicted wounds, it's hard to believe with the spike in unemployment, the massive numbers of people who've applied for unemployment benefits, that this polling reflects the views of people who have, at least temporarily, lost their jobs. And some of them will not be called back until a lengthy economic recovery. And I don't think that you can take shortcuts. But Trump imagines that he can. And despite the numbers in that poll, take a listen to this. There is a conservative news and opinion website called The Bulwark, and they posted this video, which has popped up at the New York Times in a different form, and you may have seen it stitched together by other people. But check this out, because this is a reprise of Trump's comments since January.
No, I don't take responsibility at all. We have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China.
January.
And we have it under control. It's going to be just fine.
Now the Democrats are politicizing the coronavirus. You know that, right?
End of February at a rally.
They're politicizing it. One of my people came up to me and said, Mr. President, they tried to beat you on Russia, Russia, Russia. That didn't work out too well. They couldn't do it. They tried the impeachment hoax, and this is their new hoax. My administration has also taken the most aggressive action in modern history to protect Americans from the coronavirus. But the
March
political
3rd.
attacks from some of the Democrats really must stop.
So if, we have thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that get better just by, sitting around and even going to work, some of them go to work,
March
but
4th.
they get better.
Look, we're in great shape compared to other places.
March
we are
12th.
in really good shape, and we want to keep it that way. I am officially declaring a national emergency.
March 13th,
Two very big words.
12 days ago.
The action I am taking will open up access to up to $50 billion. We see what's happening. We see what's going on in other countries. We're looking we're learning from watching other countries, frankly. This
March 15th.
is a very contagious virus.
Dr. Fauci said earlier this week that the lag in testing was, in fact, a failing. Do you take responsibility for that?
No, I don't take responsibility at all because we were given a set of circumstances and we were given rules, regulations, and specifications from a different time.
Oh, that's the blame Obama. That's March 13th. So consider, this is in circulation at a conservative website. So there are some thinking people who may support Trump because they think he's been good for their selfish economic interests, or maybe they think he's going to end abortion. But I think this is pretty stunning. Now, here's our daily COVID-19 news update, edited by Linda Lewis, and she's offering some interesting comments today that I'll quote. The total data right now, 54,453 identified coronavirus cases in the United States. The death toll, 737. Internationally, worldwide, 413,000 cases, 18,400 deaths. And, of course, those numbers continue to climb. More than 10,000 National Guard members are now activated across the United States, helping to deliver food, supporting local emergency management agencies, and I approve of that role. I don't consider that to be a threat that could lead to martial law or extreme measures of that sort. And the Pentagon, and again, this is not a threat that they're going to put their troops on the streets, at least not yet. A top U.S. military medical official said the Pentagon's modeling shows that the pandemic is likely going to continue to grow in the next 3 weeks. Inconveniently, that goes past Easter. Quote, we think the best way to limit the growth or mitigate the growth is to limit the measures that we've been talking about. I don't think there's a great deal of value in speculating on a particular day. This is according to the surgeon, Joint Staff Surgeon Brigadier General Paul Friedrichs. Wow, what kind of medals are on his breast? If we stop doing the right thing today because we think something is going to happen in 4 weeks, we will make this worse. What we need to do is focus on what we individually and collectively can do today to mitigate this outbreak. Linda next takes a look at conflicts of interest. Before Trump called for reevaluating the steps that have been taken, 6 of his top-earning clubs and resorts had to close. President Trump's private business has shut down 6 of its top 7 revenue-producing clubs and hotels. The company, which Trump says is run day-to-day by Eric and Don Jr., hasn't said whether it would apply for a bailout, but Congress has fixed that, and we'll cover that a little bit later. Now, this really bizarre idea that there are Americans of my age who are willing to say, open up the economy even if it kills me. They've been joined by Bob Corker. Remember the guy who was in the Senate on his way out and he said, don't poke the bear, referring to Trump. He said, should my generation be willing to have a degree of sacrifice and risk so that younger generations can have a better life? I think so, he said. He and I are the same age. And Bob, you're poking the wrong bear with this comment. He went on, the fear that I see in people's eyes is the fear of small business people watching their entire life's work vanish. The fear of the working poor, realizing they're not sure how they're going to be able to support their families. Now, this is hogwash. Bob Corker is a little bit more reasonable, a little bit more moderate than the average Trump member of the United States Senate. And while I haven't followed his every word and legislative achievement, the idea that he cares about the working poor is laughable. And Linda notes time and time again, when Republicans have expressed concern for small business people, they're actually promoting policies that benefit powerful corporations, sometimes hurting small businesses. For years, they've used the myth of family farms to say that, they're the ones who are going to be hurt by this move or that move. In agribusiness, these huge corporate farms have been the beneficiaries of government socialism. Because of their losses from Trump's manic trade war with China, he's shoveled billions of dollars, I think it's up to $30 billion now, at corporate farmers, and there are a few family farmers in there. I don't want to dismiss that entirely. But the minority of family farmers are put front and center to distract you from the bailouts that go to big corporate agribusiness operations. Linda also shares with us that there are many ugly scenes across the country. Typically, attacks on people who are perceived as Asian. And white, arrogant people there's one incident here in San Francisco where an Asian American was on the street and a white woman who was wearing a face mask came up. She yelled at him, blamed him for the virus. She pulled down her face mask and spat on him. And that scene has been repeated in many cases. And Linda points out that the virus appears to meet the statutory definition of a biological agent. And even if we don't know that it's a bioweapon yet, or I don't want to say yet, but at this point we don't know that, somebody who infects another person can be charged with making a terrorist threat. Linda then reviews the status of trying to deliver badly needed support to the frontline medical professionals, the simple things like plastic gloves, face masks, gowns. Well, FEMA has started shipping some of the respirators from the government's emergency supply. New York City had requested 2.2 million of the N95 masks from national stockpiles, and they've received 78,000. And many of these supplies have also expired. And Linda adds, as you may know, she was a crisis response government official, government employee. She says that in 2005, she participated in medical countermeasures work group tasked with advising the White House on pharmaceutical supplies to include in the national stockpile. And she advocated rotating supplies out of the stockpile prior to expiration. But apparently that hasn't happened. She then takes a look at the U.S. State Department, instructing its top diplomats to press governments and businesses all around the world, including Eastern Europe and Eurasia, to ramp up exports and production of this medical equipment. Now, these are many of the same nations that we have alienated through Trump's temper tantrums, his attacks on NATO and NATO allies and European Union members, and the idea that his bad will is going to be returned in this moment with goodwill is pretty silly. And we've just pumped out, we're about to, over $2 trillion to prop up the American economy. And I'm not aware of a single dollar that has been earmarked for some people outside the United States in any way, shape, or form. And Trump is belligerent. He said, America will never be a supplicant nation, even as we are begging these people or leaning on them. And, he was exposed trying to get a German firm to accept $1 billion to give exclusive license to the United States for a purported coronavirus vaccine that is in development. Linda also recaps what's going on in the manufacturing sector in the United States. And former Defense Department officials told the Washington Post it could take more than a year for car makers or aerospace factories to start making ventilators. Now, Elon Musk, who was a skeptic of the impact, kept his Tesla workers on the line after, in fact, the sheriff had to come and tell him to shut down the assembly line. He's trying to, repair his reputation. He found, 400 ventilators in China and paid to bring them to the United States, and he's trying to, as I say, salvage his reputation. So currently, the most comprehensive policies in the United States affect citizens in California, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Washington, West Virginia, and Wisconsin, along with, of course, New York State. Mississippi and Oklahoma are on the other end of the spectrum. Neither has instituted social restrictions except for closing schools. And a handful of mainly progressive states have enacted laws expanding paid sick leave for workers who contract the virus or must care for a loved one who becomes infected. And here in California, our Governor Gavin Newsom said yesterday that an April lifting of the stay-at-home and social distancing measures that he ordered would be sooner than any of the experts he talked to would believe is possible. And he is looking at mid-June as when some of these measures can be relaxed. So California may be, we're not totally locked down, but we are staying at home for the most part. And by the way, I work in splendid isolation here at the Secret Studio, and it's the only other place I go besides my home and occasional trips to the grocery store these days. So while I'm bending the rules a little bit to bring you this podcast, I feel justified in doing so. But I am prepared that this is going to go on for a while. And no blue sky bullshit from Trump or happy talk is going to change the situation on the ground. Now, I want to caution that this is not a blue sky comment. But we are seeing in preliminary data here in California that there has been a rollback, a slight one, in new infections. And in New York, Governor Cuomo has reported that this week there is a slight dip in new cases and in hospitalizations. But if you take a look at the graphs of China, of Italy, and I think also in Iran, we saw how the line went straight up to the sky, took a little dip, and then returned, heading for outer space. So I want to be hopeful that these measures we're taking are slowing the spread of the virus in California, but it truly is too soon to tell. And Linda has some early data from New York City that gives us a little better understanding of the impact on younger Americans. Now, 48% of the cases are people under 45 years of age, but a majority of those patients are surviving, accounting for just 3% of the city's 192 fatalities to date. But don't let that fool you, because there are some young people dying, and the rate of hospitalization and the number of serious cases is still of considerable concern. And this morning I was listening to the Rush Limbaugh show. Rush is not doing well because of his cancer diagnosis. He did appear in a recorded clip for a minute or two to tout that one of his listeners, because this woman was wearing a T-shirt that he promoted, appeared on, of course, the highly credible Fox News channel to say, well, you know, I tested positive for the coronavirus, and my symptoms lasted 3 hours. And he used this to suggest that this is nothing to worry about, and the media has created a crisis mentality to bring down Trump. All that stuff continues. Now, watch out for scammers. If you tried to order a surgical mask from the website Protective Mask Direct, well, apparently they're collecting boatloads of money, and they're not shipping any masks. So be aware of that. Now, a little bit later, toward the end of the podcast, I'm going to do a quick roundup on some of the responses to the pandemic in some nations around the world. I do like to respect that America is not the only place on the planet, and we'll bring that to you a little bit later. Now we turn to the bailout bill. We're learning details of it. There has been passage in the Senate. The House is going to use a unanimous consent procedure that apparently doesn't require a quorum, so that those who are not near Washington are not going to be expected to travel back for the vote. They're not allowed to vote remotely, but they'll put as many people as they can into the House chambers and, with a voice vote, approve the Senate package. And it's fair to say that the Democrats, by holding out since Sunday and not allowing Mitch McConnell to cram the Republican-drafted bill down our throats, well, there are some improvements. Loans for distressed companies would come from a $425 billion fund controlled by the Federal Reserve, and $75 billion would be doled out, it looks like, by the Secretary of the Treasury. But the language that would allow him to delay disclosures of who he shovels the money out to was removed. It has to be disclosed in short order. They also pressed for stronger oversight, including an inspector general, a congressionally appointed board to monitor the giveaways, and companies that benefit could not engage in stock buybacks while they receive government assistance and for 1 year after that. Democrats also won on a provision ensuring that Trump family businesses or those of any other senior government officials cannot receive loan money through that fund. They could, however, still potentially benefit from other parts of the bill. The agreement upped the money for hospitals and health systems across the country from a measly $15 billion to $100 billion, and that we can credit Chuck Schumer for. Also, they tucked in $400 million for election assistance. This is aimed at setting up vote-by-mail systems for the November election. But the Brennan Center for Justice, they have an election integrity unit there. They've said that this falls short of the $2 billion that would be needed to ensure that the elections take place on time and in a fair manner. And this is consistent, I believe, with the checks that they're going to mail to American families, $1,200 per individual. I don't think that's going to be sufficient, and I don't think a one-time payment of that amount is going to do much more than a short-term boost to the economy. And it could be wasted money because the economy could tank again if we see a second or even a third wave of virus infections. And the Washington Post has an article under the byline of Tracy Jan, pointing out that after conservatives over the years have gutted the social safety net, in a crisis, they are rebuilding parts that have been solidly shredded in recent years, like those direct cash payments that Andrew Yang talked about during his campaign for president. And they have included language that I think is fair to unemployed people who are on a payroll somewhere, but they have widely divergent needs and different income levels. So, for example, here in California, yes, people make more money, but the cost of living, especially housing, is substantially higher than many other parts of the country. So they settled on a $600 bump to unemployment benefits. And the Democrats got language, and I'm not sure how this is going to work exactly, but independent contractors, self-employed people like me, gig workers like musicians and Uber drivers, they're going to be permitted under this law to apply, at least this time, for unemployment insurance. And here in California, I think the top weekly payment is about $450 or $500. That's going to go up to about $1,000 with the supplemental money supplied by the federal government. So with the expansion of that to cover the gig workers, anybody who doesn't get a regular paycheck, this is a much more progressive package than it started out to be. There is still the regressive element that people under $50,000 will receive less of a payment than people who make $75,000 or $100,000. That's bullshit. But apparently the Democrats were unable to move the Republicans on that issue. Also related to the unemployment benefits I mentioned, they're also extending the timeline for that coverage. So I consider that to be a positive development. Also paid family leave, which is anathema to most Republicans, up to 12 weeks included in this package. Now, that's not great news. I think it's better than I expected. But the giveaways are still a major part of this package. Let's take, for example, Boeing, the airplane manufacturer. They've got facilities in Seattle. I think they have 70,000 employees in Washington State and a big operation in North Carolina. That's their union-busting plant. And, of course, Boeing is already on its knees before any of this happened because of their self-inflicted wounds with the shortcuts they took on the 737 MAX that led to 2 crashes and the grounding of the entire fleet of those planes. But Boeing said that they needed $60 billion. The Senate is giving them $17 billion in a federal loan. And it appears that there will be an additional grant and that Boeing is likely to use the grant money to pay the loan. So, this is the kind of pro-corporate bias that exists among both parties, but it is extreme in the Republican Party. And I was right, 70,000 workers in Washington State for Boeing, 150,000 worldwide. And get this, Nikki Haley, who is the former Trump appointee as UN ambassador and a darling of the Republican Party, a rising star, she resigned from the board of Boeing over its decision to seek public assistance. She doesn't want to be associated with any goddamn socialism, even corporate socialism. And for the moment, I'll praise that move. So some of the money that's being handed out to corporations is characterized as grants, and some are loans. In some cases, the loans can be forgiven if the companies meet certain requirements, like keeping people working. Craig Holman, our buddy over at Public Citizen, said that companies like Boeing are likely to have more options available to them in the capital markets, and they should try that first before they go to the federal trough. Every day when I remember, I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Fine Americans like Doug Cooper, David Ratcliffe, Elizabeth Vasquez, and Faith Peoples. Faith has multiple subscriptions, and I really appreciate all the people who chip in to keep this operation going. If you want to join them, all you have to do is click on over to peterbcollins.com Click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You hit the sign-up page, and that's where you can choose levels of support. And I don't have the latest list in front of me, but somebody responded to my request for new subscribers to replace the people who are conserving their cash and have suspended their subscriptions to the podcast. And anyone who's able, I appreciate your willingness to do that. Also, another element of the bailouts, American Airlines is like Boeing, a company that has put itself on the financial edge before this crisis hit. They figured that with all the baggage fees that they've been gouging the public with, the cutback in food service, you can get a free soft drink, but you have to pay for almost everything else on a plane these days. And the New York Times has a sob story here without mentioning how they chewed up all the profits that they made over the last 7 or 8 years with stock buybacks to enrich the top management people. And then they increased their debt load at the same time. Well, it starts this way. Monday morning, American Airlines Flight 1 departed JFK, bound for Los Angeles. It had 6 passengers. The flight is normally one of the airline's busiest, most profitable. Now it's a money pit, a cross-country symbol of how thoroughly the coronavirus pandemic has decimated commercial air travel in a matter of weeks. Never before has customer demand dropped so swiftly. And never before has it been less clear when or even if the airline industry will truly recover. Well, hell, we're shoveling money at them. And they largely have monopolies, or at least duopolies, on most of the lucrative routes that they service, and you will not get a tear from me for these profiteers. I want to recommend a piece by Scott Ritter. You know him, the former weapons inspector, Marine Corps intelligence officer. He's been very busy publishing stories, and in fact, I've invited Scott for a fresh interview early next week, and he's accepted, so we'll bring you that. One of the items we'll talk about is his latest article. COVID-19 has exposed just how broken American economy and society are, and a $2 trillion package alone won't fix it. And I'll just allow that I've had some interesting conversations with Scott on this podcast, and we had a fascinating exchange. I guess it was in December. Maybe January, I don't know. It was on Consortium News live video feed. And Scott is a little more conservative, or maybe even a lot more conservative than I am. And so keep this in mind as you read his piece. I'll quote, "The coronavirus pandemic has exposed some uncomfortable truths about the state of America today. First and foremost is the fragility of the American economy. After years of outsourcing manufacturing, the U.S. has constructed an economy where service industries comprise 55% of overall economic activity. In the age of globalization, with interconnectivity functioning seamlessly, this model has been able to generate the appearance of prosperity with a booming stock market and increased GDP. The reality, however, is that the American economy lacks resilience in time of crisis. The ongoing trade war with China, combined with a depressed global oil market." And by the way, Scott wrote a great piece about the Russian-Saudi oil wars. I expect to talk with him about that in our interview next week. Quoting again, "The trade war, combined with the oil market, were in the process of exposing this reality before the coronavirus pandemic. The national lockdown, resulting economic stoppage, only accelerated what was a gradual economic recession in progress. Even if the U.S. economy could be taken off stimulus-driven life support, the conditions that preceded the shutdown still exist, and if anything, have only been exacerbated by the impact of the pandemic on global economic health." So he goes on, and I hope you'll follow the link in the show file at peterbcollins.com to read the whole piece. And yes, it was published at RT, so what? Also, I want to mention, related to the oil wars, that we have now a full-fledged glut. Most of the world's storage facilities are nearly at capacity. And the experts predict that the crude oil price on the world market may drop to $10 a barrel in the near future. That hammers American oil operators, the frackers, the extractors, the people who are killing the planet with the sludge that comes from the North Slope. And, in turn, that puts a drag on the U.S. economy. It could be a moment where we could reconsider and say, we should leave that shit in the ground. But we won't. Now I want to turn to the plight of people who have no say in their current situation and the likelihood that they'll be exposed to the coronavirus. In New Jersey, the first detainee of ICE has been identified, tested positive for the coronavirus. This followed the infection at the same facility of a correctional officer reported last week. This 31-year-old Mexican detainee, being held at the Bergen County Jail in New Jersey, is now hospitalized, and I believe that is the first of many reports we'll see of those who are confined because of their immigration status and the Trump crackdown, will be sickened and some may die. And Kevin Gosztola reports from Chicago, where there is a lot of squabbling over which prisoners deserve to be released to reduce crowding, reduce the prospect of in-prison transmission. There are already 2 prisoners at the Cook County Jail tested positive, a 42-year-old and an 18-year-old. But the Cook County State's Attorney, Kim Foxx, and the alleged progressive mayor, Lori Lightfoot, are treading very carefully. Now, one of the issues they raise is significant, and that is that some prisoners, if you release them, don't have a home. They don't have a crib to go and crawl into and hunker down and weather this medical storm. But that's where we should provide resources and support for nonviolent pretrial detainees and individuals of that sort. So I've linked to Gosztola's report, and likewise you can find it in the show file at peterbcollins.com. Then we have the people who are vulnerable at home, partners of abusers, family members who are no strangers to domestic violence. And it is a critical issue. Trump didn't mention that in his parade of horribles, suggesting that reopening the country is going to reduce suicides and similar pathologies. But this is a concern that we have to be vigilant about, and I encourage you, living in close quarters can be difficult. People who ordinarily spend 40, 50 hours a week out of the house are now there 100% of the time, and long-simmering tensions can erupt. So please keep an eye on that. Interesting report from an investigative news site called Sludge, and I have not fully investigated them, but I consider this to be quite a credible report under the byline of Donald Shaw. Headline, Biden sides with Big Pharma against plan that could make coronavirus vaccine affordable. And it kind of gets into the legislative weeds. But back in 1980, Congress passed the Bayh-Dole Act, establishing procedures for private companies to patent inventions built upon government-funded research. Yesterday, I explained that Gilead, which has cut off compassionate use of the remdesivir drug, they developed it with $79 billion of your money and mine. And the Trump White House has called it an orphan drug. Well, it's got 300 million parents. It's not an orphan. But Gilead is claiming it as its private property. And the government is allowing it. Would Joe Biden stop that? Well, it appears unlikely. Because unlike Sanders, Warren, Harris, Buttigieg, the other presidential candidates of now and then, they embraced using the Bayh-Dole law to try to make any developed vaccine or treatment drugs affordable. But Joe Biden doesn't support this, which is called march-in rights. And by not embracing it, he is aligned with the pharmaceutical industry, which, by the way, has made massive donations to support Joe Biden. For example, Joe Biden's campaign and the outside groups backing him have taken over $1.34 million from the pharmaceutical industry. Bernie Sanders has received somewhere around $400,000 from individuals tied to pharma. And the pro-Biden super PAC, Unite the Country, which has spent $11.8 million, mostly trashing Bernie, well, it is, one of the top leaders is a friend of Biden named Larry Raskey, founder, chairman, and CEO of Lasky Partners, a lobbying firm for Eli Lilly. That's where Alex Azar, the Health and Human Services Secretary, used to run the show. Another member of the Super PAC's professional team, Amanda Loveday, is an associate director of NP Strategy, and they lobby for healthcare and pharmaceutical industries. Speaking of Joe Biden, there is a lamentable article at The Atlantic under the byline of Alex Wagner. And it just shows what an empty vessel the Democrats are foisting on us to be the presumptive nominee at this point. Now, Bernie has not capitulated. He is now saying that he'll show up for debate in April and challenging Joe to do the same. But follow the link and read Wagner's piece, because she starts by saying about what a weak campaign operation he ran. One event just days before his big victory in South Carolina attracted 6 people. Biden walked out to a podium, mumbled a few words about the improvements he wants to make to Obamacare, and then shuffled off alone. And she says that voters seem to have coalesced around Biden for his past, rather than for anything in his present. It's as if Biden exists primarily as an idea rather than an actual candidate. Let's go a little deeper here. Through it all, the fairly awful campaign events and confusing statements and garbled debate performance, the idea of former Vice President Joe Biden has remained consistent and apparently convincing as both Trump's inverse and co-equal. Sanders may still be in the race, but this is a detail. Democrats have chosen Biden as their vessel for Trump's defeat, and that choice is the entire point. The vanquishing matters more than anything else. And as you know, I deeply believe that these Democrats who have, and mostly boomers, come out to vote for Biden in the primaries are betting on the wrong horse in a very dangerous way. Take a listen to this. It's an interview by Katie Halper of a woman named Tara Reid, who formerly was a staff assistant to Joe Biden when he was a member of the United States Senate.
Hello and welcome to the Katie Halper Show. I'm about to play an excerpt from an interview that I did with Tara Reid. The full episode will be up shortly. As a warning, Tara discusses sexual assault during this interview. Tara was one of 8 women to accuse Joe Biden of some form of inappropriate touching last spring, after Nevada politician Lucy Flores alleged that the vice president inappropriately touched her during her run for Congress. Tara told journalists that in 1993, when she was a staff assistant to then Senator Biden, he put his hands on her shoulders and rubbed his fingers up and down her neck. But Tara says there's more to her story, and she considered telling it last spring. But after coming forward and being smeared as a Russian agent and being doxxed, she did not. We now know from Ryan Grimm's 324 article on The Intercept, Tara did try to come forward once again in January of 2020. Tara turned to Time's Up, the nonprofit dedicated to helping women in the post-Me Too world tell their story. But Time's Up, Ryan Grimm reports, was concerned such a political story involving a potential presidential candidate could affect their nonprofit status. So here, Tara finally tells the rest of the story that she hasn't been able to tell in the past. Not surprisingly, there are no witnesses to Tara's story of alleged assault, But Tara's brother and Tara's close friend, both of whom I spoke to, recall Tara telling them about the incident at the time.
So I've put up a link to the SoundCloud recording of Katie Halper's podcast, and you can listen to Tara Reid's own comments. And the idea that this group Time's Up, which is a nonprofit that has raised $24 million to pursue predators of Me Too victims, cannot support Tara Reid, because they're a nonprofit and you can't get involved, that's bullshit. And that is explained in Ryan Grimm's excellent report on this issue. In Israel today, the Prime Minister's buddy, the Knesset Speaker Yuli Edelstein, has resigned. But before he made it effective on Friday, and then he adjourned the Knesset to prevent the Blue and White Party, which now has 61 lawmakers in a coalition, that is a bare majority, to prevent them from meeting to pass measures including nominating their own people to the key committees and passing a law to prevent an indicted politician from serving as prime minister. That is aimed at acing out Benjamin Netanyahu, and that's a move I support. And it took the Israeli Supreme Court to order Edelstein to reopen the parliament, the Knesset, but he did so in a way that, again, serves the interests of Benjamin Netanyahu. We'll see how all this plays out, but it is a fascinating set of developments. Also in the greater Middle East, Turkey has announced indictments of 20 Saudis for the assassination of Adnan, I want to call him Adnan, that was his dad. Adnan Khashoggi was an arms trader back in the 80s. His son Jamal was the guy who was strangled and dismembered, and the bone saw, of course, was infamously used to dismember him. And now these 20 men have been served with indictments from Turkey. It appears to be for show. I don't know that any of the Saudis will ever return to Turkey to face the music. And as you may know, in Saudi Arabia, they did press charges and then dismiss them against one of these suspects, a guy named Ahmed al-Asiri, a former advisor to the Crown Prince, MBS, but his top dog, al-Qahtani, Saud al-Qahtani, who is the enforcer of the Crown Prince, he, of course, faced no charges at all. Now, as promised, a quick recap or a look around the world at the nations who are dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. And the New York Times reporting that the UN has asked for $2 billion from donors to support the poorest nations in the world. And this is a certainly worthy effort, but $2 billion seems like chump change. And since we're going to borrow $2 trillion for a temporary Band-Aid on the U.S. economy with shoveling cash gifts to select corporations, I think that we ought to fund the entire $2 billion and urge other countries to match that, if not multiply it. So this would include covering Palestinians in refugee camps, also the Gaza Strip, and many nations in Africa and in Asia, which do not have the resources to deal with the likely impact on their healthcare systems and the risk of widespread infection in their countries. Vladimir Putin gave a talk to the Russian people today. He gave them a week-long national holiday starting Saturday, and he announced the postponement of the referendum to make him president for life, or at least until 2036. He spoke to the Russian nation from his country residence, his dacha, outside Moscow. He stopped short of ordering a national lockdown like India and many European countries, but he warned that despite the relatively few confirmed infections so far in Russia, that it is objectively impossible to stop the virus from spreading, and he postponed without a new date the April 22nd referendum, attempting a coronation of Putin for lengthy terms. Yesterday, we mentioned I think it's 800 Cuban doctors who've been dispatched to Italy to supplement or give relief to the medical professionals who have been battling the impact of the crisis. I have linked to a report over at the Gray Zone Project by Anya Parampil, who takes a look at Cuba's efforts to help the Italians. In Mexico, President AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is pretty casual about the whole thing. He's still appearing in public and kissing babies, and he probably, it appears that he wants to pursue life as usual. Quote, "I'll tell you when to not go out any longer," explaining that the pandemic is only in its first phase. "If you're able and have the means to do so, continue taking your family out to eat, because that strengthens the economy." That's what Devin Nunes said just a couple of weeks ago, to widespread derision. I'm a little surprised by that. I thought of AMLO as much more of a man of the people. Excellent report from Alan McLeod at Mint Press News today about Brazil. Now, you know that their far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, who is attempting to set up quite an autocracy by dismissing both the Congress and the courts. Well, he took a trip to Mar-a-Lago and spent the weekend with the Donald. And as you know, most of his Brazilian delegation came back with a gift. They tested positive for coronavirus. You were thinking maybe they kept their embroidered bathrobe from Mar-a-Lago. No, they got coronavirus. And Bolsonaro himself was first reported by his son to have tested positive, and then the son denounced the media for publishing fake news. But his response has been very lame. And as McLeod points out, in the infamous favelas, the massive slums in Rio and São Paulo, it is the gang leaders who control much of these areas who have decided to pick up the slack. We want the best for the population, they said. If government won't do the right thing, organized crime will. Now, their measures are not too extreme. They're asking people to go back to their shacks by 8:30 p.m. But it appears to be more stringent than what Bolsonaro is ordering people to do. And middle-class people in some of the urban areas are kind of riffing off the Italians, who are singing opera from their windows. They're not singing. They're shouting. And they bang on pots and pans and yell into the darkness, "Fora Bolsonaro." Get out, Bolsonaro. They're mad as hell. And some of them just don't want to take it anymore. Thanks for listening all the way to the end of my daily news and comment podcast, a bit extended because of all the news. You are free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain a healthy Peter B. Collins. You stay that way, too.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.